The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Then Jesus began to say to all in the synagogue in Nazareth, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard that you did at Capernaum.'" He then said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them were cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. And they got up, they drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of a hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went away. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, that's a great story, and we have talked about it before. So I want to take the opportunity to go back and talk about Paul's monumental chapter in 1 Corinthians, chapter 13. It says, again, I know we just read it, but let me give you my translation. "If I speak in the languages of humans and of angels, but do not have love," agape, "I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and have all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for languages, tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. But then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love remain. These three. And the greatest of these is love. Wow. One of the most astonishing chapters in the whole Bible. When we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we see a hymn that was dedicated to the love of God. Early Christians would often elaborate in similar ways on love or on faith, as in Hebrews chapter 11. But Paul's use of this great phrase of agape, here it's not just theoretical, it directly challenges the behavior of many Christians. Many of those Corinthian Christians who were boastful and arrogant and rude and proud. It's impossible to understand chapter 13 without seeing the final verse of chapter 12. In that final verse, and remember when Paul wrote, he didn't write chapters, he was writing a letter. In that final verse that we've marked off as chapter 12, he says, but strive for the greater gifts. And now I will show you a still more excellent way. Then verse 1 of chapter 13 launches into the supremacy of agape. If I speak in the languages of mortals and angels, but do not have agape, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Not just that the gongs and the cymbals were loud and sometimes irritating. The pagan cults of Corinth, and indeed all other places in the Greco-Roman world, were known for their noisy instruments. These pagans would go through the city clanging their gongs and their noisy cymbals. Now, when Paul speaks of the languages of angels, some scholars debate whether Paul is implying some specific angelic language. And there is some evidence that suggests that some ancient Hebrews may have believed in this, or was he simply using it as an exaggeration? The moving of mountains by faith, well, that was an ancient figure of speech and is also used in some other Jewish sources. It simply meant doing what was virtually impossible. In verses 4 through 8, Paul repeats at length some of the characteristics of agape, love. And let's just say that agape is love. Paul's repeating of this, the characteristics of agape, love is patient, love is kind. It was a device used by great writers and great orators to cleverly repeat sounds in which it almost produced a rhyme, and it kept the attention of the reader or the listener. But when we realize that agape, one of the 4 Greek words for love, is the Greek word that is used to describe the love of God. Plato had said that only God can agape. John's first epistle tells us that God is agape. God is love. And then he also says in the Greek, and agape is God. So when we look at the descriptions of love in verses 4 through 8, first part of verse 8, we can easily see that these characteristics are the very characteristics of God. So read it like this: God is patient. God is kind. God is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. God does not insist on God's own way. God is not irritable or resentful. God does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. God bears all things. God believes all things. God hopes all things. God endures all things. God's love never ends. It changes the way you look at God. At least it does for me. In verses 8 through 13, Paul tells us that as valuable as God's gifts are here and now, they are not as permanent as the love of God. Paul says that as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for languages, tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. Paul is a good preacher, and he repeats this phrase 3 times, once again to emphasize his point and to cause us to remember. The Greeks called it anaphora, an ancient rhetorical device that drives home a point and sounds good to the ear. But let's talk for a minute about prophecy, what it looked like in the ancient world. People in the first century wanted to hear from their gods, and they tried to in different ways. They drew lots. We can hear about in the ancient high priests in the Hebrew Bible, they would draw out these two stones, the Urim and Tumim. One was a black stone, one was a white stone. One of them meant yes, another one meant no. So you got a 50-50 chance of hearing what you want to hear. Should I do this thing? No. Try it again. Yes, that's the one I want. Well, non-Israelites tried various omens, like they would see the flight of birds, or they would look at sacrificial animals and cut them open and look at the intestines inside, things like that. Hearing from their gods was important when they were preparing for battles or for other important matters. Now, the line that's most important, or I should say the most important and direct form of guidance for the Israelites, that was prophecy. Remember when Ahab is going to battle and Ben-Hadad II, the king of Damascus, the two of them were going to go off and fight, I think, the Assyrians, and they said, well, let's go find the prophets. They wanted to hear what the prophets had to say. Most of the people in the ancient world, including the ancient Hebrews, saw prophecy as speech directly inspired by their deity. The Greeks often used inspired speech with the frenzy of like possessions, but they could also use music or poetry as some sort of prophecy. Many believed that it couldn't be controlled, and that's not really a view that Paul shares. Although most prophecy involved direct inspiration, it could be dictated, written down, and delivered on a later occasion, like in Jeremiah chapter 36. Some used prophecy as merely a literary device, but most regarded prophecy as directly inspired, even if it was later edited into a more suitable format. The oracle at Delphi of the Greeks, or at times in the prophetic books in Scripture, our Scripture. By the end of the first century, though, many Jews, perhaps especially among the elite, doubted that prophets flourished in their own day, like they had in ancient Israel. Such skepticism as this characterized the Sadducees and probably most of the Pharisees. Josephus, the Jewish historian, allowed for prophetic speech, but apparently not for prophets. It just would happen on some people, and they would speak this prophetic word, and then that's it. One and done, as we say. Didn't allow for there to be prophets. That's not a view the early church shares. Paul certainly doesn't. He talks about the gifts of prophets and evangelists and pastors, teachers, and what's the other one? Apostles. Some Judeans and Samaritans did allow for prophetic figures, like those in the wilderness, sometimes with deadly consequences. The Essenes, the ones from whom we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes believed that prophecy and God's Spirit remained active among them. The followers of Jesus and John the Baptist are among those who believe that the prophets still existed. Most prophetic and spirit-oriented of all were the early Christians. They believed that they lived in a period of renewal of prophecy and of prophets. Just like in the Hebrew Bible, Such prophecy needed to be evaluated. Sometimes those who claimed to be prophets really weren't speaking anything except out of their own ecstasy or their own aims. But even when prophecies were true, like in the Hebrew Bible, no one expected them to really become part of Scripture. Although some Scripture included prophecy, and a small proportion of prophecies were recorded in Scripture, they were all different forms of revelation and never meant to be a foretelling of the future. The people of the time knew that what Jeremiah was prophesying wasn't something in the far off future. The book of Daniel was not prophesying something that was going to take place at a later date. They all knew that it was something that had to do with here and now. We have twisted the word prophecy to mean fortune telling or a foretelling of the future. And somewhere along the line in the 20th century, somebody came up with the idea that, oh, there is a current interpretation of prophecy and a future foretelling. No, there's not. There's nothing that Paul never said anything about that. Jesus never said anything about that. But when we see in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Thessalonians, we see that prophecies seem to have been widespread in the early church. Paul also recognizes the limitation of prophetic insight. Like other forms of knowledge, prophecy is often limited, like in 2 Samuel chapter 7 or 2 Kings chapter 2 or Luke 7 and Acts chapter 21. But then we get those great concluding lines. For now, we see only a reflection, like in a mirror. Then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. Now, what's he talking about there? He's talking about when love is perfected in us, then we won't see in this, as King James says, in a glass darkly, dimly in a mirror. We'll see love face to face. Now, I only know a little bit. When I know love perfectly, then I will know fully. Even as love, as agape, as God has always fully known me. And now he says, faith, hope, and love, they remain. These three. And the greatest of these is love. The greatest of these is agape. There will come a time when we won't need faith. We won't need hope, but we will always need the love of God. Thanks be to God.